Good evening, and we are back in October Sky. We are going to start today on chapter 26, and just to give you a little reminder of what we're heading into, this is after the science fair. This is after Sonny has won the medals, and after, sadly, he's gone to visit Miss Riley, who he finds out is in the hospital, and after he presents the medal to her, because he says that she is the reason he won. And leaving off with that chapter as we head into the new one, chapter 26, we see that Sonny learns the whole story of what happened after his display had gotten all messed up, and how everyone at home helped replace the items that he needed for the science fair. So moving into chapter 26, we are on page 405. All systems go. Actually, we're on page 407. It took me a while, but I finally managed to piece together what happened in Coalwood after my nozzles got stolen. The boys gave me their version. Mr. Caton told me about his part, and then I heard the rest from my mother. In less than an hour, the fence line telegraph had alerted the whole town that I was in trouble. Mr. Caton headed for the machine shop, but a line of union men, including Mr. Dubonnet, stopped him. Although Dad said the best thing to do was nothing, Mom made him drive her to the machine shop. Then he saw Mr. Dubonnet and got out of the Buick and went nose to nose with him. Roy Lee said it was as if the two of them were finally where they wanted to be, with nothing to keep them apart. Mom was ready to let them fight it out, she said, but Mr. Caton pushed in between and said, "Now look here. You won't find a better union man than me, and I know we don't have no contract, but we've got to help that boy. He's not up there just for himself. He's up there for Coalwood." So remember, guys, Mr. Dubonnet is for the union. Mr. Caton is in the union, but he wants to be able to work. The union doesn't want them to work. They want them to strike, right? But Mr. Caton says this isn't about us. So that was when Mr. Boondini, we're at the top of page 408, showed up in his Jeep and told everybody to break it up. Odell said Mr. Boondini had a big smile and went over and tapped Mr. Dubonnet on the shoulder and said, "How about we talk a little, John?" "Oh, your dad was mad," Mom said, frowning at the memory. Martin Boondini just left him standing there and went off with his arm over John's shoulder. He was so mad he started to cough, and that made him even madder. Roy Lee, who heard most of the inside union talk from his brother, said Mr. Boondini told Mr. Boondini there wasn't all that much to talk about, that the men would be back to work as soon as a union management panel was set up that would approve the list of men who were to be cut off. "That's not all he wanted," Sherman shrugged, telling me the side he heard from his father, which was the management side. He also wanted all the men who had been cut off last time to be hired back, because it had been done wrong. Remember how Mr. Dubonnet did not like how the men had been cut off when the mine first started suffering? Well, that's all John said he wanted, Mom told me in her version. But John's smart. He wanted something else, something personal out of your dad. Your dad's smart, too. He knew it. Mr. Boondini was in his glory, Sherman laughed. He was being the great peacemaker. But he wasn't telling the union everything he knew either. "Let's see if I understand you correctly, John. Mom imitated Mr. Boondini's Yankee accent. The company still pays the number of miners who will be cut off. Then this panel agrees who those men will be, based on seniority and union rules. Is that it? And hiring back the men too?" Roy Lee rolled his eyes. Your dad finally stopped coughing and grabbed Mr. Boondini and argued with him. "Don't do it, Martin." What he's not wanting him to do is to give in to Mr. Dubonnet's wishes. I don't know why I keep saying Dubonnet. Mr. Dubonnet was laughing the whole time because he'd already won and he knew it. "I hated that it was my rockets that had made Dad give in to the union. Don't you worry about that, Sonny," Mom said. This time he needed to give in. Mr. Boondini took your dad aside and they started whispering back and forth. Roy Lee said, "Your dad was shaking his head back and forth just as hard and fast as Mr. Boondini was nodding his up and down. It turns out," Mom sighed, "that our Ohio miners had made a big deal with General Motors. It needed coal and fast. The union could have asked for little pink hearts to be patted on their lunch buckets and the company would have given it to them. Your dad was caught in the middle. Odell's eyes were wide with excitement. Then Mr. Dubonnet yells out so everybody can hear. Homer signs this time. He means Homer's going to sign the agreement, which he knows will kill Homer, because Homer's been fighting against the union the whole time. Mom said, "Oh, your dad got hot. You can forget that, John," he yelled. "I'm not signing anything." Mr. Dubonnet had the agreement already. Billy told me he had this folder under his arm, and he opened it and took out a paper and brought it over and shoved it right under your dad's nose. Mom shook her head. John told your dad, "I don't often agree with you, Homer, but by God, I trust you. The company will sign anything and then go do whatever it wants to do. But if your name is on it, I know you'll quit if the company tries to pull tricks. You sign it or there's no agreement." Mr. Boondini signed it right off, Royley said. Then he told your dad to sign it too. Mom was up on her ladder painting in another seagull. Remember on her little painting in the kitchen? At the rate she was going, her sky was going to be filled with them before she was through. I told your dad to go ahead and sign. What difference would it make after all? We were leaving for Myrtle Beach, weren't we? She put down her brush, climbed down off the ladder, and eyed her work critically. His look told me all I needed to know. I told him, "Oh, Homer, I should have known." So basically, Homer let her know, just by the way he looked, that they were not going to be going to Myrtle Beach. Practically everybody in Coalwood was in a circle around the machine shop by then, Odell said, his eyes wide with the memory of it. Some women had even brought card table chairs and were sitting down to watch. It was like a movie. "Elsie, if I sign this, it's my word. I'll have to stay." Mom shook her head, looked out at her rose garden and her telephone pole thick fence. That's what he said. I looked at everybody around us and then at the other boys and then up at those blamed old mountains. Well, what else could I say but what I did? I had to do it for you, didn't I? I said, "Sign it, Homer." "I'm sorry, Mom," I said. I really was in a big way. She gave me her look that said she didn't quite believe me. Your dad asked me if I was staying with him. I told him if I did, he didn't deserve it. Then you know what he said? No, ma'am. He said that was the truth. She poured herself a cup of coffee and then went over and dabbed a little brown paint on a coconut. Well, how could a woman leave a man who admitted he wasn't good enough for her? I would make a note here. It's kind of sad in a way. But I would make a note that Homer has given in to Mr. Dubonnet's wishes. And so he's made an agreement, basically signed an agreement with the union. So that's the way I would put it. Homer has given in and signed an agreement with the union, which is killing him, in order to make it basically so that Mr. Caton can build the nozzles that need to be built to replace the ones that were stolen from the science fair. And in doing that, he has now let Elsie know that they can't go to Myrtle Beach. So Elsie's agreed to that because that shows they give up something important to them for their son. That's what parents do. So Royley shrugged, and that was that. Your dad signed, and then Mr. Caton ran inside the shop and got busy. We boys went in and swept up while he and a couple of the other machinists did the work. Now, they're still talking about what happened when he was working on the nozzles for Sonny. So they're still talking about the story of what already happened. People were coming in all the time, hurrying things up. Odell built you some new boxes, and I burned rubber all the way across Welch Mountains to make it to the Trailway Station in time. When you called to say you won, I swear it was like the whole town cheered. You could hear it all up and down the valley. I listened to everybody who told me their version of the story and said the same thing to each of them and meant it too. I wish I'd been there to see it. In all its history, I think it was Coalwood's best moment. Even though my dad lost to the Union and my mom was forced to stay a little longer in the hills, Jake had it right. And I would underline this. There's a plan. If you're willing to fight it hard enough, you can make it detour for a while, but you're still going to end up wherever God wants you to be. That's the truth. I really, really like that. Even sometimes when it's not His will for you, He will allow things to happen because that's the plan that you've chosen. And sometimes He allows that for you. Graduation night finally came, and the Big Creek High School class of 1960 walked proudly down the aisle in the gymnasium to receive our diplomas. The boys in green gowns, the girls in white. Dorothy was our valedictorian. Quentin, his B's in phys ed catching up with him, was the salutatorian, tied with Billy. Isn't that funny that the B's in physical education caused him not to get valedictorian? Sherman and Odell were in the top 10. Roy Lee and I were back in the pack. So Roy Lee and Homer were the only ones not up there with all the top class members. Dorothy made a speech. I stirred uncomfortably when she raised her eyes from her prepared remarks and seemed to be looking directly at me. She said, "I know each of us will always care what happens to every other person in our class. We have been very lucky to have been joined together by a wonderful experience. Our 3 years together here at Big Creek High School. I will never forget you." Then she went back to her speech while I fidgeted. So I would make a note that Dorothy was the valedictorian and Quentin was the salutatorian. I would make a note of that. And I would basically also just point out that when Dorothy gave the valedictorian speech, that she directed her words toward Sonny. When Mr. Turner handed me my diploma, he stopped me for a personal word. "You've brought great honor to the school," he said. "Not bad work for a bomb builder." He had placed my National Science Fair medal in the trophy case of gleaming football awards, along with an award certificate that read, "A study of amateur rocketry techniques. Homer H. Hickam Jr., Big Creek High School, War, West Virginia. Gold and Silver Award, 1960. So I would make note of that Mr. Turner proudly displayed his medal in the trophy case along with the football awards. The boys and girls of Big Creek went back to their chairs and held their diplomas and looked at one another, filled with present joy and impending loss. Dorothy left before I could talk to her. I took Melba June to the graduation dance that night. Dorothy wasn't there. I would not see her again for 25 years. After graduation, the BCMA gathered in my room. In a more perfect world, perhaps, everything would have worked out as Quentin hoped, and we would have all gotten scholarships because of our win. It didn't happen. Instead, Odell, Billy, and Roy Lee took the Air Force recruiter up on his offer. Immediately after graduation, they were headed for Lackland Air Force Base for basic training, and then they would use the GI Bill for college. Sherman said his parents had come up with some money for him to go to West Virginia Tech, and he was going to work for the rest of it. I decided to take my mother up on her offer on an Elsie Hickam scholarship. Remember the Johnson & Johnson scholarship? I was still trying to decide which college to go to, but I thought maybe the engineering program at the Virginia Polytechnic Institute. Quentin may not have gotten his scholarship either, but he said if boys from McDowell County, West Virginia could win a prize at the National Science Fair, he was sure he could figure out how to go to college even if he didn't have any money. He had decided to enroll at Marshall College in Huntington, West Virginia. He wasn't certain how he was going to pay for it, but he'd figure it out when he got there. Somehow, I knew he'd do fine. I would make a note of what all the friends and Sonny end up doing. So I would go back and make a note of what they all end up doing there. Okay? The only thing left for BCMA to do was to decide what to do with the 6 rockets I had brought back from Indianapolis. Sherman suggested we split them among us for souvenirs, but Quentin wouldn't hear of it. "Sonny, I've got a great idea," he said. "See, we get this big balloon and fill it full of helium. Then we hang our best rockets from it and let it float up about 10 miles and then launch. I've done the calculations. We'll make it into space." Odell had another thought. "Let's make a day of it," he proposed. "Launch from morning to night. We'll put up notices, have Basil write us up, make it a big deal." "It would have been a way of thanking everybody," Roy Lee said. Sherman and Billy both said they liked it. Quentin sat down hard on the edge of the bed. "We could have done it, you guys," he said sadly. "We could have gone into space." Ah, Quentin, it's a miracle we ever got anything off the ground at all, Roy Lee laughed. Let's do this and get out of town while we still can. For the last time, we posted our little notices at the Big Creek store in the post office. Between the ads for whole chickens and fresh milk in his paper, Basil did us proud. It is a moment that may go well down in McDowell County history. On June the 4th, 1960, the Big Creek Missile Agency, fresh from its medal-winning performance at the National Science Fair, is sponsoring a day of rocket launches at its Cape Colwood range. Everyone reading these words is invited. I tell you this writer will be there, and with him everyone I know. There is no more inspiring sight than that of a sleek, silvery BCMA rocket blasting off from its black, sparkling, slack launch pad, bustling into the sky with a backdrop of green mountains, splitting the blue sky with its roar as it hurtles high on a great column of smoke. This may very well be the last chance we will have to see this grand sight, this amazing sight, this glorious sight. So I would make a note that that's what they decided to do with the rockets. They're just going to have one big day at Cape Colwood and launch all of them. My basement lab stank one last time with Zinco Shine preparation. 6 rockets curing at once. All the boys came to help, and the fumes of the remnants of John's Eyes elixir left us all a little giggly. I woke early on the first Saturday in June, the day of the final launches. I moved to my window, as I had done so many times before, to look out at the mountains and the highway that led past the mine. I half expected to see the usual line of miners making their way on the path to and from the tipple, and Dad among them getting his reports, giving his encouragements and directives, but the path was empty. The mine hadn't gone to a full 7-day shift, even with the new orders for coal. I heard the familiar sound of the backyard gate opening and closing, and there Dad was, going alone up the path to the mine. It's kind of sad. He walked hurriedly with his head down as if the world depended on him getting to his office not a moment late. His hands were jammed deep in the pockets of his loose canvas pants, and his dented hat sat on the back of his head. A car came down the road from the Welch direction and turned right toward Town Central. Another followed it, and then another. When I went to the kitchen and made myself breakfast, I heard the faint rumble of more cars and trucks passing the house. I thought for a moment they might be going to our launch, but that wasn't possible. It wasn't to begin for another 2 hours. I went back to my room and put on my summer launch day clothes, jeans, short-sleeved shirt, and boots. Before I left, I took a look around my room and suddenly felt as if I'd returned to it after being gone for 50 years. There were my shelves, heavy with books and stacks of notepaper filled with the calculations that had defined our rockets. There was my little dresser and the airplane models on top. Pieces of rockets, old nose cones, bent casements, and scarred nozzles were scattered everywhere. The feeling of being gone and then returning was so strong, I had to sit down on my bed for a while. In times past, Daisy May would have sought me out, rushing to get her head petted and her ears scratched. Nothing stirred. I sat alone, everything quiet, except for the sound of cars and trucks passing by. Roy Lee came to the back door, knocking politely. I met him in the kitchen. Mom was at the kitchen table in front of her beach painting, which she had finally finished. There was a beach house and a woman standing in front of it, looking out to sea. Wow, you think that woman represents her? Don't blow yourself up, Mom said, with a look that defied interpretation. Yes, ma'am. Quentin arrived as we were loading rockets in the back seat of Roy Lee's car. Aux 26, was so long we had to roll down the window to fit it in. Quentin and I sat in the back seat, gently cradling the rockets. Billy was waiting with Sherman on the bridge that crossed over the creek to Sherman's house. They wedged into the front of Roy Lee's car. We met Odell at the frog-level crossroads, and he squeezed into the back and in between rockets, careful not to bend the fragile fins. We spoke little. A mile before we got to Cape Colwood, we came upon the first parked car. Tag was there. He motioned us to him. Bet there's never been so many cars in Colwood since it was built. I'm going to park them alongside the road, single file. The people can walk in from there. We were astonished at the number of cars and people behind us. More were coming. Roy Lee had put 2 cases of pop and a gallon jug of water in the trunk to offer our audience. We were going to be a bit short. Some people saw the rocket sticking out of the window, and shouts of encouragement rang out. The rocket boys, "Whoo! We're proud of you boys!" A-OK, all systems go. Some of the people we recognize, but not most. They're coming from all over the county, looks like, Billy said in wonder. We drove out on the slack and unloaded our rockets with tender care. Tags seemed everywhere, shooing the curious away from us, turning cars around that violated his single-file parking dictum. I looked up the road past several curves, and the sun sparkled off parked cars as far as I could see. The Coldwood Women's Club was setting up a picnic table with all kinds of pastries and jugs of punch and tea. Tag reserved special places of honor for Sherman's and Odell's parents and Roylie's mother. It was noon by the time we were ready to get our first rocket off. We ran up our flag. It was the same one Odell's mom had made for us nearly 3 years before. A little tattered, but still serviceable. Wind was negligible. Quentin disappeared downrange, trailing telephone wires and carrying his theodolite. We signaled Tag when we were ready, and a hush fell over Cape Coldwood. I looked through the blockhouse portal before beginning the first countdown and saw Miss Riley sitting at the women's club table. 2 of the great 6 teachers were fanning her. Jake stood nearby with Mr. Turner. Now before they launch it, just picture the scene, guys. Here's this small town. Here's a group of boys that at first people just made fun of. And it was all about football. And here's these boys that were made fun of now being cheered on by people from all over the county that you could have never imagined coming to this small town to see such an event. You got so many people, and then they've got pastries they're selling. They've got refreshments. They've got the great teachers there. You just can't imagine a happier scene in Coldwood. I don't know if there ever was before or ever was after a greater scene than there was that day. AUG 26 had a simple countersink nozzle. It zipped off the pad and flew nicely downrange as if buoyed by the cheers and applause. 3,000 feet, we all agreed, and altitude was reported to the crowd, which oohed and awed appropriately. AUG 27 was a 1 1/4 inch wide, 3.5 foot long rocket designed to reach 10,000 feet. When it took off, it jumped from the pad on a silvery column of smoke, stuttered strangely in little puffs, and then seemed to find its way. Another spout of fire sending it hurtling skyward. Since it had been the last rocket we had loaded, maybe the Zinco shine did not entirely cured. The crowd, still growing, took no notice of its problems and clapped and yelled exuberantly as it disappeared. It hit with a ground-shaking thunk downrange, 9,000 feet. Not bad for a little rocket not given time to cure. We hauled out AUG 28 and set it up. It was designed for 15,000 feet. Readying the rockets for launch was hot work, and refreshments were sent over. Mr. and Mrs. Boondini and their beautiful daughters waved at us from the picnic under the trees that shaded the clearing by the road. I saw Mr. Caton and our machinist in a knot. They were working the crowd like politicians, telling their rocket-building stories. Mr. Dubonnet and his union leaders stood nearby, their arms crossed, contented smiles on their faces. So guys, think about it. Here's a bunch of people, even union guys versus coal mining guys, and a bunch of them disagree with each other, right? But this one moment in time, one thing they all do agree with is what Sonny and the BC may have done. So this is a unifying factor for everyone, even who disagree about other things. AUG 28 worried me for a moment when it bent slightly toward the crowd before straightening up and flying past Rocket Mountain, accelerating on a thick plume of smoke. It's going to land behind the mountain, Billy predicted, and he was right. We saw it fall, but the noise of the crowd was too great for us to hear the familiar twang of steel hitting rock and mountain earth. I started to tell him to wait. We'd pick it up later. But Billy was off on a run, heading up the mountains. Some of the men from the crowd joined his trek. A half hour later, they all came running back with Billy holding the rocket over his head, yellow jackets in close pursuit. The crowd scattered. Jake moved to stand over Miss Riley with a folded newspaper, but the angry bees had too many targets and gave up in confusion, retreating back up the mountain. AUG 29 and AUG 30 were both designed for 20,000 feet, but with different dimensions. AUG 29 was 2 inches in diameter, 30, 2 1/4, but shorter. AUG 29 was 6 feet long, the longest rocket we had ever fired. It was 6 feet long, the longest rocket we had ever fired. It was such a beauty, I almost regretted having to launch it and see it shattered back on Earth. It took off in the mightiest roar witnessed at Cape Coldwood, tearing out of a cauldron of flame and smoke. The calculations put it just under 4 miles. AUG 30 vaulted off the path similarly, its parabola drifting up to 23,000 feet. I looked down range and saw Quentin out on the slack, joyfully jumping up and down. Arc 31 was our last and biggest rocket, 6.5 feet long, 2¼ inches in diameter. We carefully raised it into a vertical position and then lowered it on the launch rod. Inside it was the nozzle touched by Dr. Von Braun. It had been designed to reach an altitude of 5 miles. With a rocket this size, I thought perhaps we were exceeding the critical dimensions of Zinkoshine. I hoped it wouldn't blow up, but I knew it might. I knelt at its base and started twisting together the ignition wire connections. "Sonny," Roy Lee said, "do you see who's here?" I looked up from my work. "Who?" "Look." Tag opened a path through the crowd, and there stood Dad in his work clothes. Roy Lee went after him, escorted him out on the slack. I heard Roy Lee say, "Come and help us, Mr. Hickam." You don't need my help," Dad said. "I just came to watch." All the boys protested. "No, sir. You can help all you want. Whatever you want to do, sir, you go ahead and do it." I stood up, brushing the slack off my jeans. "A rocket won't fly unless somebody lights the fuse," I said. "Come on." Dad entered the blockhouse, and I directed him to the firing panel after checking the connections. "This one's yours, Dad, if you want it." There was no mistaking the pure delight I saw spread across his face as he knelt in front of the panel. Roy Lee called from the back door. "Whenever you're ready," he said. I would make note of that, guys, that they've asked him to come and light the fuse, that his own dad, Sonny's dad, shows up, and that even though he doesn't say it, it said you could see his face and the delight on his face when they asked him to light the fuse. I counted down to 0 and Dad turned the switch. Arc 31 erupted, blowing huge chunks of concrete loose from the pad. The crowd took a step backward and some of them started to run. Arc 31 seemed to split the air that filled the narrow valley, a shock wave rippling across the slack. Women screamed and men clapped their hands to their ears. We boys came pouring inside, Billy at his theodolite, Odell with his binoculars. The thunderous din didn't stop. Arc 31 kept pounding us as it climbed. Men, women, and children all watched it with mouths agape, eyes wide, their cheers stuck in their throats. At the big store, those few old men not at the launch got uncertainly to their feet as the thunder reached them. They stumbled into the road, shading their eyes. The trunk of fire and smoke tearing out of the mountains like God's finger stuck suddenly toward the sky. In his church, little Richard raced to the belfry and began to toll the bell in celebration. Some of the junior engineers down from Ohio were on the clubhouse roof with girlfriends and Jake's telescope. They raised their beers to what they saw rising from the mountains. Roy Lee kept his eye on his watch. 38, 39, 40. "Still see it," Billy announced. The great spout of smoke turned into a dim yellowish streak. "Just about gone. 43, 44. Gone," Billy announced. "Gone at 44 seconds. I did a quick calculation, assuming it was flying nearly vertical. Arc 31 had disappeared at an altitude of 31,000 feet, nearly 6 miles high. I became aware of movement beside me, and I was astonished to see Dad prancing along the slack, waving his old hat in his hand. He was exulting to the sky. Beautiful, beautiful. I know that's silly for me, y'all, but I'm just seeing this kind of a hard-shelled dad who is broken from joy, and we're just seeing a side of him. We've seen little bits and pieces of who we know he is. We know he's an honorable man. We know he really does care about people. But we've not seen a man who smiles and who seems to get excited. And here we see him yelling with excitement. As Arc 31 raced across the sunlit sky on that glorious day, I instead watched my dad and waited patiently and with hope for him to put his arm around my shoulder and tell me at last that I had done something good. Then I heard Billy yell, "There it is!" People surged from the road across the slack, following the other boys as they raced out after our last great rocket. Dad stopped his dance and put his hat over his heart. He bent over as if a great weight had suddenly been dropped on his back. He looked at me, his mouth open, and I saw in his eyes a curious mixture of happiness and pain that dissolved into fear. I went to him and put my arm around his shoulder, supporting him while he fought for air. "You did really good, Dad," I told him as a spasm of deep, oily coughs racked his body. "Nothing ever launched a better rocket than you." So I would make note of that. So, y'all, I'm sorry I'm so emotional. Some of you, I don't even know if you all find this book as exciting as I do, but I guess I just see that this is a real story about real boys who didn't seem to have a chance making their dreams come true. We see a struggle between a boy and his father, who at the beginning we found out didn't want another boy. But we see this father who, even though it seems hateful at times, does everything for Sonny. And then we see at the end this dad show a side we have not seen of him before. We actually see him smile and we see him get excited. And then it ends with the dad being in pain, which is kind of heartbreaking, because you think sometimes in people's life they wait forever to get this love and attention they want from a parent, and then all of a sudden it seems like everything starts to go downhill. So it just kind of breaks my heart to think about that. So you've got a lot of happy and sad moments all mixed into one. So that is the end of the book. And next time we are going to read in class together the epilogue, and we'll find out what the future was for the boys. So don't read ahead, because we're going to read it together in class. Okay? So you have a good day. See you later. Bye.